After my dad's funeral, while everyone was discussing his estate, my brother-in-law, Chris, boldly claimed that the entire inheritance, including $5 million, should go to my sister Kelly, the eldest sibling. Kelly and Chris seemed thrilled until the lawyer promptly shut them down, explaining it wasn't up to them. I'm John Watson, 42, a sales professional with a wife and 2 kids. My dad, a hardworking businessman, owned a significant share in his company. Despite his age, he never really retired. My sister Kelly, older than me, has always been a source of stress for our parents. Her reckless lifestyle, lack of stable work, and entitlement made her difficult to deal with. I've kept my distance from her over the years. When Kelly turned 50, she suddenly announced she was getting married. She introduced Chris, a younger, good-looking man who lacked ambition and charm. Not long after, Kelly began asking Dad for money to fund her extravagant wedding. She spent it quickly and shamelessly demanded more, assuming she'd inherit everything one day anyway. I watched her behavior with quiet disdain. Less than a year later, Dad suffered a fatal heart attack while golfing. His passing devastated me. While condolences poured in, I focused on supporting Mom, organizing the funeral, and handling the overwhelming responsibilities. Kelly, true to form, was absent, leaving me to shoulder everything alone. The day after the funeral, exhausted but finally able to breathe, Mom and I sat down with Dad's lawyer. We already knew the contents of the will. Then, Kelly and Chris barged in, clueless but full of audacity. Chris declared that all of Dad's assets belonged to Kelly as the eldest daughter, celebrating as if it were a done deal. "We did it, Kelly! We're set for life!" Chris exclaimed. The lawyer, unfazed, calmly interjected, "That's not how it works." Kelly shot him a sharp look. "What do you mean? I'm the oldest, I should get everything." The lawyer paused before delivering the bombshell. "Kelly, you're not entitled to an inheritance. You're not Mr. Watson's biological child." Kelly's face turned white as she stared at Mom, wide-eyed. "Mom, what's he talking about?" Mom hesitated, visibly shaken, before answering, "Kelly, you're from my first marriage." Shock washed over Kelly. It was clear she hadn't known. Her taunts about me being the favorite child suddenly felt ironic. Chris, undeterred, tried to argue, but she was adopted, right? That still makes her entitled. "No," Mom said quietly. "There was no legal adoption." Kelly's expression shifted from disbelief to anger. "This can't be true. Dad always said I was his daughter," she snapped, turning her fury on me. "So, you're just going to take everything, aren't you?" Annoyed by her entitlement, I replied sharply, "After everything Dad did for you, you still act like this? Be quiet. I'm his rightful heir." Kelly and Chris bristled. "What's wrong with a father supporting his daughter?" Chris argued. I sighed, exhausted. While it's normal for parents to help their children, Kelly had abused Dad's generosity for years, using his money to bail herself out of one mess after another. "Mrs. Watson," the lawyer, John, interjected calmly, "why don't we let Kelly review the will as well?" "The will?" Kelly's face paled. I don't know anything about it." Her panic was obvious, but it was her own fault. Dad had asked us to sit down together when drafting it, but Kelly dismissed it and went out instead. When I mentioned this, Chris turned on her with a furious glare. "What were you thinking? That was important." Flustered, they agreed to listen as the lawyer read the will aloud. The terms were clear. The inheritance was split between me and Mom. It also detailed Dad's reasoning for not adopting Kelly. He had initially planned to, but over time, he grew disillusioned by her behavior, her treatment of me, her half-brother, and her reckless spending habits. Kelly sat frozen, unable to process. "Dad, What now? Chris, however, exploded. You lied to me. You said you had money. His tone turned aggressive, startling both Mom and Kelly. I wasn't surprised. Chris's greed had always been obvious. Perhaps he married Kelly for her supposed wealth. Don't come back until you've got money, he snarled at her. What? Chris, what do you mean? Kelly stammered. I thought I'd be rich. This is unbelievable. Pushing past her roughly, Chris stormed out, leaving her standing there, stunned and humiliated. Kelly's anger quickly turned to us. She glared at Mom, her voice rising. Mom, why didn't you make sure I was adopted? This isn't fair. Only you and he get everything, and I get nothing? How could you let this happen? Tears streamed down her face as she sobbed dramatically, clinging to Mom. Mom, fix this. It's not right. Her outburst filled the room, but the lawyer remained composed, seemingly unfazed by the theatrics. Kelly's voice cracked with fury as she directed her final question at me. Why does he get everything? Because I'm Dad's son, I replied coldly. Kelly's eyes narrowed with rage, and before I could brace myself, she lunged at me. It would have been better if you were never born, she screamed, her voice laced with venom. I silently thought that even if I hadn't been around, Dad would have likely made the same decision. Kelly's behavior spoke for itself. Before I could respond, the lawyer stepped in, his tone firm. Kelly, if you continue this outburst, we will involve the police. She flinched. Perhaps remembering her past run-ins with the law, her history of shoplifting had always been a source of shame. Kelly, our mother called out softly, tears brimming in her eyes. 6 months passed, and the inheritance process moved forward without a hitch. The lawyer, professional as always, kept my sister and her husband at bay, leaving them little room to interfere. My mother did give Kelly a small sum of money, but I chose not to comment on it. What really bothered me, though, was how they vanished with the money, showing their true, gold-digging colors. It left a bad taste in the mouths of relatives who knew the full story. One day, at my wife's suggestion, I took my mother, wife, and daughter out for a meal. Since Dad's passing, my mother had been more withdrawn, but she seemed to perk up in the presence of her beloved granddaughter. Hey Mom, what do you think about moving in with us? I asked casually. You know, Kelly might pop by every now and then. She only seems to show up when she needs something, right? Don't let her take advantage of you. My mother hesitated. Her reluctance was understandable. Kelly was her biological daughter, after all, and if our family moved into the house, there was no telling what trouble Kelly might stir up. I respected her concerns and asked her to think about it. As I dropped my mother off at the family home later that evening, we noticed lights on in the house, lights that shouldn't have been on. The house was supposed to be empty. Maybe Kelly had returned. I parked the car in the garage. Let's stop in for a quick coffee, I suggested, not wanting to leave without checking. As we approached the entrance, a car suddenly swerved towards us, its headlights blinding. The car narrowly missed us. Reacting instinctively to my daughter's terrified cry, I threw myself in front of my wife, shielding her from the car's path. Ugh! I grunted as the car grazed my side, sending me tumbling into the flower bed next to the driveway. The car screeched to a halt after hitting the garage entrance. Are you okay, honey? My wife asked, rushing over to help me up. My daughter was crying, her hands shaking as she clung to my wife. I slowly got to my feet, dazed, as my mother stood at the door, trembling, shocked by what had just happened. A sense of panic filled the air. I was quickly rushed to the hospital by ambulance and ended up staying overnight. It wasn't until later that I learned the driver of the car was Chris Adams, my brother-in-law. He told the police he had mistaken the accelerator for the brake, But something about his explanation didn't sit right with me. When my mother and sister visited me in the hospital, my sister shot me a cold look and said, "You're surprisingly resilient, aren't you?" I couldn't help but think that if I had been seriously injured, my mother would have inherited everything. "Too bad for you," I replied with a smirk. My sister stiffened. "You were counting on it, weren't you?" I could tell she was uncomfortable as she quickly looked away. "Well, Mom told me she plans to waive her inheritance for me, so this accident was pointless," I said, watching her expression falter. She seemed stunned by this revelation. Clearly, the idea of someone refusing an inheritance was foreign to her. "I have a wife and kids, so Mom wants me to pass it on to them. That's what parents do," I added. But, my sister stuttered, as though trying to grasp the concept. "I even made a will early on, following Dad's example," I continued, leaving her speechless. "So unfortunately, my share won't be going to Mom anymore." My sister trembled with rage as she stared at me, then asked, "Can't you at least give me some? There's $5 million, right?" I refused firmly, and her face twisted in fury as she grabbed my collar. "Give me half. I'm your sister." I looked at her with pity as she screamed, her voice unnervingly shrill. Her greed was clouding her judgment. "Don't you realize that your greed would disappoint Dad?" I said, my voice calm but firm. Her face flushed with anger, and she lunged at my throat, her fingers tightening. "Kelly, what are you doing?" my mother cried out, her voice shrill as nurses rushed in to escort my sister out. My mother, though clearly upset, didn't intervene much further, likely because she knew how much my sister had insulted her too. "Where did I go wrong in raising her?" My mother's voice cracked with sadness. It was heartbreaking to hear her say that. Shortly after, my mother fell ill. Her condition worsened quickly, and my wife and I stepped in to assist with transportation and household tasks at the family home. This seemed to upset my sister, likely because she'd encountered my wife during her visits to ask for money or had heard about our involvement from our mother. One day, my sister called me abruptly, her tone cold. "From now on, we'll take care of Mom. You two don't need to come," she said, as if it were already settled. "What's this all about?" I asked, trying to reason with her, but she hung up on me, claiming it was decided. I confirmed with my wife, who had received the same dismissive message, concerned about my sister's lack of caregiving experience. I quickly called my mother to check in. To my surprise, my brother-in-law had some caregiving experience. My mother was still relatively independent at that point, so I felt somewhat relieved. However, within a month, my mother was rushed to the hospital after a medication error. When we arrived, she looked incredibly frail. The doctor was baffled. My mother had never made such a mistake before. While my wife stayed with her, I went back to the family home, only to find it in disarray. The fridge was empty, despite my mother's love for cooking, and it seemed the hired help had been let go without so much as a word. I felt disgusted for even considering trusting my sister with this responsibility. To make matters worse, I discovered a significant amount of money had been withdrawn from my mother's bank account. Her bank card and PIN were securely locked in a safe, so how had this happened? The inheritance remained untouched in a safe deposit box, but the funds intended for living expenses were completely drained. I gathered the essentials for my mother's hospital stay, along with her bank card, and went to explain the situation to her. "Did Kelly?" My mother's voice trembled as she asked, unsure of what had happened. She seemed unaware of the missing money, but when I asked about the medication error, her face turned somber. She confessed that my brother-in-law had prepared the medication. "Mom, maybe it's time we stop letting my sister into the house," I said gently. "I'll take care of you, but the house is a mess. And you've lost so much weight. Are you eating properly? Her words weighed heavily on me as she nodded quietly, her expression a mix of regret and exhaustion. Mom, why don't you come live with us? I'll make sure we all have a home together, I suggested. The words seemed to break her, and she burst into tears. Despite my best efforts, my mother's health continued to decline. Perhaps the stress of the situation with my sister had taken a toll on her heart. She never recovered and passed away, as if following my father. When I returned to the family home to make funeral arrangements, I was met with an empty house. The valuables were gone, and it didn't take long to figure out that my sister and brother-in-law had taken everything. I stood in the empty rooms, initially shocked, then filled with a white-hot anger. I vowed to hold them accountable for their actions. The day after my mother's funeral, my sister and I were set to meet with the lawyer to discuss the inheritance. Too bad. Mom's inheritance rightfully belongs to me, her daughter, my sister boldly declared. I couldn't help but laugh, unable to believe how wrong she was. Let's see what the will says, I suggested, and the lawyer began reading. My sister's face drained of color as the words sank in. No, this can't be. Kelly isn't entitled to anything. That's Dad's final wish, the lawyer stated calmly. This is absurd. Kelly's that old woman's biological child, my brother-in-law shouted, sweeping papers off the table in frustration. You can't deceive us. Give us the inheritance now. Chris, did you try to harm my mom? I asked, confronting him directly. He glared at me, his face twisted in irritation. What? I didn't do anything like that, he snapped. Then why was there a mistake with her medication? I pressed. He scowled, clearly annoyed. Who cares about that, John? This is ridiculous. We're not getting anything? My sister interjected, her composure slipping. I turned to her, stunned. What have you done? You didn't rush over when Mom passed away. You were just waiting for the inheritance, weren't you? Tell me this isn't true, she demanded, glaring at the lawyer. I'm getting nothing? The lawyer paused before carefully explaining the inheritance distribution, but after accounting for the amount my sister had withdrawn and the things she'd sold, there was nearly nothing left. She scratched her head in frustration, clearly unsettled by the outcome. This was all discussed with the lawyer beforehand. I interjected calmly. That can't be. It can't be this little, my sister muttered to herself, her dissatisfaction obvious. Having always relied on our parents and never having worked for a living, she was completely out of touch with reality. I couldn't mask my contempt for her any longer. Mom thought you'd take care of her, but all you did was take her money and abandon her. You're so ungrateful, I shot back, my anger getting the best of me. Taking care of someone costs money. You know, she snapped in response. What are you talking about? I challenged her. Then show me the receipts for the expenses you used on Mom's care. I'll cover the necessary costs, I said, extending my hand. Her face drained of color, and her lips trembled. I don't have those. Without receipts, it won't be recognized, the lawyer added firmly, leaving my sister speechless. My brother-in-law, noticing the situation turning against them, tried to appeal to me in a pleading tone. John, your sister really needs help. Can't you lend her a little, just a bit? I shook my head firmly, my patience wearing thin. It seemed my brother-in-law was reaching his breaking point too. If everything had gone according to plan, Kelly would have had the entire inheritance by now, he muttered bitterly. What do you mean by that? I asked, suspicion creeping in, but before I could push further, he inadvertently revealed more than intended. Because of this guy, nothing ever goes smoothly. I was supposed to get a new car, but all I got was barely enough for repairs. he said in frustration. My sister tried to intervene, but it was already too late. That's a serious accusation. Sounds like fraud, the lawyer said, holding her ground. This meeting is being recorded, and both of you agreed to that. My brother-in-law's face drained of color as he realized his mistake. Turning to him, I said coldly, Chris, I'll be pressing charges for that accident. Don't be ridiculous. There's no evidence, he shot back, but I only smiled. You've just provided the evidence yourself. At that, my sister burst into tears, shaking her husband in frustration. You fool! This is all your fault. What are we going to do now? She cried. Eventually, my brother-in-law faced criminal charges, and his past offenses came to light, leading to his detention. My sister, implicated as an accomplice, received a lesser sentence, but without the money she had hoped for. She couldn't even afford her rent and sought help from relatives, only to be rejected by everyone. As for me, I moved forward, working diligently without relying on any inheritance. The small pleasure I found was in the steady dividends from my stocks, a modest consolation amidst the chaos.